Well, the good thing is that, in the Chinese communist system, the People's Bank of China can print more money and not have to publicly disclose what's happening. So there's not going to be a consumer panic over inflation. It'll still cause inflation, but it won't be the panic kind necessarily. And I mean, it will cause further problems down the line when you essentially devalue your own currency. But those problems, fortunately, are in the future.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the size of the Chinese banking industry, it's absolutely enormous, and they continue to lend. I added it up, and for many reasons, this is not a perfect comparison, but just as a simple example, if you added up the liabilities that the two real estate developers in the news, Country Garden and Evergrande, have right now, liabilities that people will probably recover 25 cents on the dollar at the end of the day. Those two amounts of liabilities are roughly the same amount as the entire amount of bad loans China says exist in all of China right now. Okay, those two companies alone are roughly equal to the amount of non-performing loans that China says that they have in the entire country.
So you're saying they're lying?
I think I'm beginning to suspect it's not entirely accurate. Okay.
Weird. So this would be the first time that the CCP has fudged statistics to make itself look better.
Especially economic statistics. They never do that.
They never do that. I'm as shocked as you are, guys. Okay. I'm blown away.
And I actually am wondering, now that you talk about this increasing need for like party control, government control over the economy, how this is going to affect China's kind of expansionism, like economic expansionism abroad, things like the Belt and Road, because that was just an exercise in like exporting their excess capacity, right, to other countries. And like, hey, if you can't build any more bridges in Zhejiang, you're going to go build bridges in Africa or things like that. Like, is that a way out for them?
Let's put it this way. Just generally speaking, my default, and I say this is true of the US, this is true of China, this is my general default. We should never ascribe to malice what can easily be ascribed by incompetence. Okay. And so when we talk about Belt and Road, I think there's a lot less malice there than there just is incompetence. And what I mean by that is, I don't think there was ever any serious plan. I think a lot of the basic indications is that Xi Jinping walked into a room and said, guys, I got this great idea. Let's lend money to Africa. This can't lose. Okay. And so everybody beneath him said, okay, guys, let's go out and start lending money to Africa and other places like this and do that. And then they figured it out as they went along. Okay. Because if you look at the amount of capacity, for instance, that is being soaked up by Africa or other places, in the background of China, it's not even a rounding error. Okay. I mean, it's basically irrelevant. And so you look at some of the projects that they did, and one of the things is a book that had an impact on my thinking about the U.S. is if you go back and look at what the U.S. did a lot of post-World War II in shaping the international environment, they basically took a lot of the technical institutions and made them international technical institutions. Okay, the WTO, different things like that are basically just, they basically have U.S. type of counterparts, for lack of a better term. And so I say that because I think China went out and acted in a very Chinese way internationally. Okay, and so you look at like Sri Lanka, they built this port. I don't think at the beginning there was any let's say, malice intended to say, let's go out and build something that is going to be a complete failure so that we can have a PLA base. Okay. It was probably just said, guys, you got an ocean. What can we do with it? Hey, tell you what, let's wildly expand this port. And the one that I think has gotten a lot less attention in Sri Lanka is they built this massive airport in literally like the middle of Sri Lanka, not anywhere near anything. And now, I saw this documentary there's literally like wild animals roaming this unused airport. Okay. And so I say this not really to defend China, but to say they didn't really think it through. they went out and behaved like China behaves domestically. And they built a bunch of stuff that may or may not ever be used, because that's the Chinese model. And that's the problems that they're running into now domestically as well as internationally with Belt and Road.
So rather than this well thought out comprehensive plan to become a global military power and take over the world, it's just them juggling things and seeing what sticks.
I think that's in my estimation, I think that's a much more accurate view of I think what unfolded.
Well, so how about this? Because this is something a lot of people are commenting on now, that like, well, the out for China is a war. Wars can make lots of money, it can distract from a lot of problems. What do you think about that? Like, is war China's solution to its economy?
So I'm actually when you look at, so I think there's two answers to that. I've been on record, and I can probably find it somewhere for some time, saying I think you have to look at within 18 months to 2 years of Xi Jinping's third term, that China is going to do something on Taiwan. Okay. And this was before their current economic issues. And I think that's still a very reasonable thing. And you look at how they're behaving, just if you guys have seen the map that China released this week, basically they pissed off pretty much every one of their neighbors by claiming some part of Russia, some part of India. I mean, they're even claiming Filipino territorial waters. They basically, if you're remotely close to China, they're probably claiming part of you. And so I think there's two answers to that. This was who China was before their current economic issues. So in a way, China's not really changing. Okay. The economic issues now may speed up that process a little bit. It may delay it. It may cause them to be a little bit more aggressive. It hasn't changed China in any way. I mean, this is who China was before these economic issues. It's who they're going to be for the foreseeable future. The current economic issues might nudge things forward or backwards a little bit, but it hasn't changed who China is at all.
So one of the things that China seems to have been doing well on economically lately is green technology. That is, as countries around the world, the Western countries are looking to implement more policies related to climate change and renewable energy. China has come in and said, well, we'll build your solar panels and wind turbines.
If we're talking about innovation and productivity.
Right.
Well, I mean, except that a lot of that innovation was actually stolen from...
Yeah, innovative stealing.
It was innovative stealing. And one of the latest things is electric vehicles, which also were not an original Chinese innovation. But now China is exporting more cars than I think any other country. They've surpassed Japan. Most of these cars they're exporting, I understand, are electric vehicles. And while you can't buy them in the United States yet, certainly like Australia and the UK are now starting to see these like BYD Chinese electric cars on the market. So is this good for China, and is this good for the West?
So there's a couple answers to that. So just briefly touch upon the macro issue. I think one of the issues, the environmentalism, I'm not an expert on this, but I've definitely read enough to say, I think it bears worth examining whether or not electrical vehicles are the environmental panacea that they have, that their supporters have made them out to be. Because this is an enormous, to create the batteries for a single car creates an enormous amount of environmental issues, from how the electricity is generated to the mining of the metals. Most cars have anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of metal in them, which make them, which requires a lot of mining. So I think that's the first issue.
So there's a lot more input than like a combustion engine. An
enormous amount more. And there's even some real interesting studies on the life cycle emissions of EVs, meaning from the time metal gets pulled out of the ground till the time that car gets scrapped. what is the life cycle emission of things, and you account for how the electricity is generated. And it's basically a lot more mixed than I think, we think of an EV as like, oh, I'm environmentally friendly. It's actually a lot, depending on some different factors, it's quite possible that it's actually negative for the environment. But more specifically, I think one of the things that people need to consider, especially when we're talking about China, is that these are basically mobile surveillance devices, and EVs are fundamentally different than combustion engine cars. They typically have about a tenth the number of moving parts, or parts, period, as compared to an EV, or compared to a combustion engine. And then they also have a lot more semiconductors. And so, I can speak firsthand the amount of data that China gathers on cars and EVs within China. You can even count, for instance, which seatbelts are buckled, who's driving it, all kinds of things like that. I can tell you one that made me laugh. It was basically a software program that truckers used in China, so that it limited the number of hours a truck could be driven for safety reasons and things like that. But one of the things that I found funny was is it actually recorded the party membership of truck drivers. Okay, their political affiliation, which I was like, I'm not sure why that matters for truck driving safety, but hey, this is China we're talking about.
Red asphalt.
It was puzzling, but. And so, so we can't say for certain that China is actually collecting data on those cars that are exported, simply because I haven't seen it. But they use the same components, batteries, and one of the reasons that batteries are very important is that's kind of like the heart and the brain of an electrical vehicle is the battery. Because the battery interfaces with every individual unit, from the entertainment to braking, things like that. If you think about, let's assume you were talking about a 50-year-old car, that is actually a manual procedure. So you press the brake, and that actually pushes the brakes. Okay. In an electrical vehicle, when you push the brakes, you're not actually pushing the brakes. You're pushing something, and that sends a signal electronically. Hey, we need to tap the brakes, but you're not actually pushing the brakes. You're pushing something that sends a signal. Okay. So it's a very different thing. And so that's why those EVs matter, because those are like the heart and the brain. They collect all of that data, and China having access to that source code and data is a very real security risk.